My name is Allison Tate. I am 36 years old. 20 years ago, my parents threw me out of their house in the middle of a November rainstorm because I was pregnant in the 10th grade. 16 years old, one suitcase, my mother pointing at the front door and telling me I was dead to them. And that same night, they had their lawyer draw up a notarized letter erasing me and any child I might ever have from the family name, the family trust, and every record they kept, as if neither of us had ever been born. For 20 years, they told everyone who asked that I had moved overseas, built their perfect reputation on the grave of the daughter they threw away. And then last week, they drove 800 miles to my front door in North Carolina, desperate, offering me $250,000 to bring their grandson to their 50th anniversary party so they could show him off to 200 of the most powerful people in Charleston, South Carolina. A grandson they had been bragging about for months. A grandson they had named after my father. A grandson who has never existed. Because what I have is a daughter, and what they found when they walked through my door is the truth they spent half their lives running from. Take a second to like and subscribe. Because what my parents found when they walked through my door that evening, and what happened to the 200 people waiting at that anniversary party, is something none of them were prepared for. I grew up in Charleston, the youngest of 3 children in a family that looked, from the outside, like everything a Southern family was supposed to be. My father, Douglas Tate, 65 years old now, senior partner at Tate & Whitfield Wealth Management, the kind of firm that managed retirement portfolios for more than 120 of the Low Country's wealthiest families, which meant every handshake he gave at a charity dinner carried the weight of other people's money and other people's trust. My mother, Sandra Tate, 63, chair of the women's ministry at Covenant Hills Church, which in Charleston meant she was the woman every other woman in that congregation looked to for guidance on how a Christian family was supposed to present itself. They sat in the front pew every Sunday morning. My mother in a pressed linen dress she had selected the night before, my father in a navy blazer with his Bible balanced on one knee, and the 3 of us children arranged beside them like ornaments on a shelf that had been dusted just before company arrived. But every family has a hierarchy, and I learned mine before I was old enough to understand the word. My brother was 22 when my life fell apart. 3rd year of architecture school, the son who would carry the family name into boardrooms and building permits and country club introductions. My sister was 20, studying nursing, the beautiful daughter who never asked questions that didn't have comfortable answers. And then there was me, born when my mother was 34, 6 years after she believed she was finished having children. I don't think she ever forgave me for arriving without being planned. The signs were constant, but quiet enough that I spent years wondering if I was imagining them. Family portraits displayed in the living room somehow never included my most recent school photo. Dinner conversations circled around my brother's studio reviews or my sister's clinical rotations. And when I mentioned making the honor roll, my father would nod and say, "That's nice," before turning back to someone who mattered more. I learned to make myself small, to not ask for much, to not need too much, to measure my value by how little space I could take up in a room full of people who shared my last name but never quite shared their attention. And I think most of us who grew up in families like that know what it means to sit at a table where everyone is eating but only some people are being fed, not with food, but with the feeling that they belong there. My father had a phrase he repeated at every family gathering, every church supper, every holiday where guests were present. He would lift his glass and say, that reputation takes 20 years to build and 5 minutes to destroy. I didn't understand then how much weight those words carried, or that I would become the 5 minutes he had always been afraid of. Those Sunday mornings were the architecture of everything my parents cared about. The drive to Covenant Hills Church took 11 minutes from our house on Legree Street, and my mother spent every one of those minutes adjusting collars, smoothing hair, reminding us to sit straight and speak only when spoken to. We parked in the same spot every week, second row, closest to the side entrance, because my mother had decided years ago that arriving through the front doors looked like you were trying too hard. Inside, we walked to the front pew and sat in the same order. My father on the aisle, then my mother, then my brother when he was home, then my sister, and then me, always at the far end, pressed against the wooden armrest with my hymnal balanced on my knees. The congregation watched us the way people in Charleston watched the old families, with a mix of admiration and quiet accounting, and my parents performed their roles the way they performed everything, with precision and without a single visible crack. What nobody saw was the silence in the car on the way home. The moment the church doors closed behind us, my mother's smile would flatten into something tired and administrative, and my father would loosen his tie and begin listing the names of the people who had spoken to him and the ones who hadn't, calculating alliances and social debts the way he calculated his clients' portfolios. Nobody asked how the sermon had made us feel. Nobody asked what we had learned. Sunday was not about God. It was about being seen, and being seen correctly, and making sure that no one in that congregation had any reason to look at the Tate family and wonder if something was wrong. My brother was the pride of the household, and he knew it without ever being told directly, because in families like ours, the hierarchy is communicated through 1,000 small gestures that accumulate over years, whose report card gets taped to the refrigerator, whose friends are invited to stay for dinner, whose voice makes the room go quiet when they speak. He was smart and steady and built for the kind of life my parents had designed for him, and I do not blame him for being their favorite any more than I blame the rain for falling in November. My sister occupied a different position, softer and more ornamental, the daughter who would marry well and raise children who would sit in their own front pews someday, continuing the cycle my mother had spent her entire adult life constructing. She never questioned anything because questioning was never part of what was expected of her, and in a house where expectations were the only currency that mattered, she had learned to spend wisely. I was what my mother once called the surprise, and the way she said it made it clear that surprises were not welcome in her world. I filled my hours at the public library downtown, 3 afternoons a week after school, telling my parents I was studying when really I just needed a room where nobody was measuring me against a standard I hadn't been invited to set. The library was the only place in my life where I felt like a whole person instead of an afterthought, and it was there, in the biography section on a rainy October afternoon, that I met the boy who would change everything. He found me crying at a table near the window, after my mother had forgotten to pick me up from school for the 3rd time that month. He sat down across from me and said the only words I needed to hear, the words nobody in my family had said to me in longer than I could remember. He asked if I was okay. And I think most women who have raised families the way my mother did, quietly, carefully, without ever once asking themselves whether they were happy, know what it sounds like when someone finally asks that question. Because the answer is always bigger than the person asking it expects. He was 18 years old, attended the public high school my parents would never have acknowledged existed, and worked afternoons and weekends at his uncle's landscaping company in North Charleston, loading mulch and running mowers in the heat until his hands were rough and his shirt smelled like cut grass and gasoline. My parents would have crossed the street to avoid a boy like him, which is exactly why I never told them his name. We dated secretly for 2 months, and he was gentle and patient and made me feel like I was someone worth remembering. Like the space I took up in the world was not a burden, but something that mattered to at least one person who was paying attention. October 28th, 2004. I stood in the bathroom of a gas station 3 miles from Ascension Preparatory Academy and stared at two pink lines on a test I had bought with money I had saved from skipping lunch for a week. My hands would not stop shaking. When I told him, he did not run, and he did not make excuses. He held my hands in that gas station parking lot and told me we would figure it out together, that I was not alone. I wanted to believe him. Part of me did. But I knew my parents, and I knew that when I told them, their first thought would not be about me or about the baby growing inside me. Their first thought would be about what the congregation would think, what the partners at the firm would say, what the women in the women's ministry would whisper behind my mother's back. I told them at Sunday dinner. I did not know it would be the last meal I would ever eat in that house. November 14th, 2004. The roast was overcooked, and I remember staring at my plate, trying to find the courage to speak while my father complained about a client dispute, and my mother calculated which families would attend the church Christmas gala. When I said the words, the table went silent in a way I had never experienced before. The kind of silence that feels like the air has been pulled out of the room and replaced with something heavier. My father's voice went cold when he asked who the father was, and when I told him the boy's name and where he went to school and what his family did for a living, I watched something close behind my father's eyes, like a door being locked from the inside. He stood from the table and told me that if I kept the baby, I was no longer part of this family, and his voice was so flat and so certain that I understood he had already made the decision before I finished my sentence. By 9:15 that evening, I was standing on the front porch with one suitcase, rain soaking through my school sweater, and it was my mother who opened the door and pointed me outside. Not my father, my mother, the woman who had carried me for 9 months and named me, and brushed my hair before church every Sunday for 16 years. My brother and sister watched from the upstairs window. Neither of them came down. I kept my mouth shut about it for years afterward, telling myself I understood, telling myself they were scared, telling myself my silence was protecting everyone. And I think most of us who grew up in families where keeping the peace mattered more than telling the truth know exactly what it costs to make that choice, and how long the weight of it stays with you after everyone else has moved on. I called him from a payphone at the gas station on Broad Street, and my hands were shaking so badly I could barely hold the receiver. He picked up on the second ring, and 20 minutes later, his uncle's truck pulled into the lot, and he jumped out before it had fully stopped and wrapped me in his jacket and held me while I sobbed into his chest in the rain. He said, "I've got you." And it was the only true thing anyone had said to me all day. We had $300 between us, a truck that needed new brakes, and nowhere to go. That was when the woman who lived 3 houses down from my parents saved my life. She was 62 years old, retired after 31 years as the church secretary at Covenant Hills, and she had watched the whole thing from her kitchen window. Watched long enough to understand what she was seeing, which was a child being thrown away by the people who were supposed to protect her. She opened her door at 10 o'clock at night and told me I could stay as long as I needed, and she meant it. 3 days after they put me out, my father mailed me a certified letter requiring my signature, as if I were a defaulted account he was closing. 3 pages of legal language stating that I forfeited all claims to the family estate, that the family bore no legal or moral obligation to me, and this is the part I have read more times than I can count, that any child born to the aforementioned party shall be permanently excluded from all family records, genealogy, and estate planning, and shall bear no claim to the family name. My daughter was erased from a family tree before she had taken her first breath, targeted by name, in a document my father had drafted with the same precision he used to build his clients' trust portfolios. I kept that letter. I have kept it for 20 years. I stood on that porch at 16 years old with rain running down my face and one suitcase holding everything I owned in this world, while my mother closed the front door without a word, and my brother and sister watched from the upstairs window without coming down. If you've ever had to make a choice between your family's approval and your own child's life, tell me if you would have stayed quiet as long as I did. Like and subscribe. Because the certified letter that arrived 3 days later is what made me understand I had not just been thrown out of a house, but erased from a family. We stayed in that woman's guest room for 2 weeks before he found us a 1-bedroom apartment in Goose Creek, $425 a month, above a dry cleaner that smelled like starch and steam and something close to hope. My daughter was born on July 6, 2005, 7 pounds, 4 ounces, 10 fingers, 10 toes, her father's brown eyes and my stubborn chin, and she came into the world screaming. And I thought, good, scream, make them hear you. Don't ever let anyone make you as small as they tried to make me. The first 5 years were a blur of survival. He worked double shifts at a landscaping company in North Charleston while I finished my GED and started community college classes, 2 at a time, whatever I could manage around the baby's schedule. We lived on ramen noodles and day-old bread from the bakery down the street, and I learned to patch clothes on top of patches until every dollar had been stretched past what it was meant to hold. He never said "I love you" in those exact words, not the way you hear it in movies or read it in cards at the drugstore. He said it by making sure the space heater was pointed at the crib before he left for work at 5 in the morning, by leaving a note on the kitchen counter that said, "Formula's in the fridge, you're doing great," by coming home smelling like cut grass and red clay and picking up our daughter before he even took off his boots. And I think most women who have raised a family know exactly what that kind of love looks like. The kind that never announces itself, never asks for credit, never once complains about what it costs. Because they have given it themselves for years, without a single person stopping to say thank you. I sent my parents a birth announcement when she was born. No response. I sent a photograph on her first birthday. Silence. By her second birthday, I stopped trying, because I finally understood that their silence was not confusion or hesitation. It was a decision they had made and reinforced every single day for 2 years. And nothing I could send through the mail was going to change it. March 15, 2010. A delivery truck ran a red light on Rivers Avenue. He was driving home from a night shift. The police officer who came to my door at 6 in the morning said he had died before the ambulance arrived. He was 23 years old. My daughter was 4. The life insurance policy he carried through the landscaping company paid out $15,000. That was it. $15,000 for 23 years of a man who had never once let me stand in the rain alone. The officer who knocked on my door said he died before the ambulance arrived, 23 years old. and the life insurance policy he had through the landscaping company paid out $15,000, which was all the world decided his life was worth. If this sounds like someone you know, if you have ever watched a young mother stand in a kitchen holding a phone with nobody left to call, tell me if this sounds like someone you know. Like and subscribe. Because what I did next, with nothing but a 4-year-old daughter and $15,000, is something my parents never imagined I was capable of. I was 22 years old, a single mother with a 4-year-old, $15,000, and absolutely no one to call. I could have given up. I did not. 3 months after we buried him, I walked into the United States Army recruiting office on Dorchester Road in North Charleston and told the recruiter I was ready. I had been thinking about it for months, turning it over in my head the way you turn over a coin when you're trying to decide something that will change the shape of your entire life. The recruiter looked at me and asked if I had dependents, and when I said yes, one daughter, he told me about the Family Care Plan, the legal document every single parent in the Army has to sign before they ship to basic training. A plan that names who takes care of your child when the uniform takes you somewhere your child cannot follow. I called the woman from my parents' street, the one who had opened her door the night they put me out, and I asked her if she would take care of my daughter while I went to Fort Jackson for 10 weeks of basic combat training. She said yes without hesitating. I will not pretend those 10 weeks were easy. I will not pretend I didn't cry at night in my bunk, thinking about my daughter sleeping in a house that wasn't mine, being tucked in by a woman who was not her mother. But I made it through. And then I made it through advanced individual training. And then I made it through 3 years as an enlisted soldier, working supply and logistics, before a colonel pulled me aside and told me I ought to apply for officer candidate school. She was 52 years old then, former battalion commander, the kind of officer who remembered every enlisted soldier's name and noticed the ones who were carrying more than their rucksack. She saw something in me I had not yet learned to see in myself. "You have talent," she told me, reviewing my service record. "Unpolished but real. Let me help you get where you belong." I commissioned as a second lieutenant at 26 years old. By the time my parents showed up at my front door, I was a captain in the Quartermaster Corps at Fort Liberty, North Carolina, responsible for the supply chain that kept an entire company of 120 soldiers fed, equipped, and mission-ready. And I had earned every inch of that rank, without a single phone call, a single dollar, or a single word of encouragement from the family that threw me away. Tuesday, November 5th, 2024. 6:47 in the evening. I had just come home from a logistics review on post, my mind still running through supply requisitions and equipment readiness reports, when I turned onto my street and saw the car. A black Mercedes-Benz S-Class, South Carolina plates, parked in front of my house like it had every right to be there. I sat in my driveway for a full minute gripping the steering wheel, watching two figures standing at my front door. The man had gray hair now, stooped shoulders, a posture that looked like something heavy had been resting on it for years. The woman still held herself with that rigid spine I remembered, that constant vigilance against anything that might suggest her world was less than perfect. I had not seen them in 20 years. I considered driving away, going to a hotel, calling my daughter, pretending this was not happening. But I was 36 years old. I was a captain in the United States Army. I had built a life without them, and I would not run from the people who had tried to make me disappear. My father spoke first when I walked toward them. He scanned me, my uniform boots, my posture, the house behind me, the way he scanned an investment portfolio, looking for numbers that confirmed what he wanted to believe. My mother stepped forward and said the words that stopped everything. "We know about your son." We know you have a son, and we would like to meet him." They wanted to reconnect as a family, my father added, as if 20 years of silence could be gathered up and folded away like a tablecloth after dinner. The absurdity of it nearly made me laugh. 20 years of pretending I did not exist, and now they were standing on my porch asking to meet a grandson who had never drawn a single breath. I let them into my house. Maybe I needed to hear what 20 years of silence had led to. My father sat in my living room the way he sat in a client meeting, assessing the hardwood floors, the built-in shelves, the military awards on the wall. My mother perched on the edge of my sofa with her hands folded and her spine straight. Their 50th wedding anniversary, my father explained, November 15th, 200 guests at the Belmont Charleston Place, the mayor, the pastor, the Rotary Club board. People had been asking questions about me, about the daughter who supposedly went overseas, and the questions had become harder to answer. But what they really needed was not me. What they needed was my son. My mother's voice was firm when she said it. They had told people about their grandson, about the next generation of the family carrying on the name. They had read a magazine article about me 2 years ago, an Army Times feature, and they had seen the word child and the word successful and constructed an entire human being out of the gap between what they read and what they wanted to believe. My father reached into his briefcase and placed a blank check on my coffee table. $250,000, he said. Bring the boy to the party, stay 3 hours, take some family photos. They were also prepared to reinstate me in the family trust, combined estate valued at $3.8 million, an equal share with my brother and sister. I stared at that check and thought about every ramen dinner, every night shift, every morning I had dropped my daughter at daycare on a private's pay because I could not afford anything else. And then my father's voice hardened. He told me that if I refused, they could reach out to my son directly, explain the situation, help him understand his family history. It was a threat wrapped in the language of concern, and I recognized it, because I had grown up listening to a man who had spent his entire career making other people's money feel safe while making his own daughter feel worthless. I was about to answer when I heard footsteps on the stairs, and everything changed. My daughter stopped at the bottom step, psychology textbook still in her hand, wearing sweatpants and a UNC Chapel Hill hoodie, her dark hair in a ponytail. She looked exactly like what she was, a 19-year-old college student who had been studying in her room. My mother rose to her feet, and I watched her face cycle through confusion, then calculation, then something close to horror. My daughter looked from me to the strangers in our living room, and understanding crossed her face the way light crosses a room when someone opens a curtain. "These are them," she said. "The grandparents who threw you out when you were pregnant with me." My mother flinched and started to say it was more complicated, and my daughter crossed her arms and asked which part was complicated, the part where they put a 16-year-old out in the rain, or the part where they spent 20 years pretending she never existed. She told them she knew everything, that I had never hidden it from her, that she knew about the letter and the inheritance papers and the story they had told their friends. My father recovered faster than my mother. I watched the wealth manager in him recalculate. "A granddaughter could work," he said carefully. "They could adjust the narrative." My daughter asked what she was supposed to be. The secret granddaughter they had been hiding for 19 years? My mother suggested they could say she had been studying abroad, recently returned, a surprise reunion. And my daughter laughed without any warmth and asked if they heard themselves, asking her to lie about her entire existence to 200 strangers. I told them to leave. At the door, my mother turned back and told me this was an opportunity to heal, to put the past behind us, and asked me not to let old wounds cost me my future. I watched them walk to their car, watched my father help my mother into the passenger seat the way he had 1,000 times before, as if this were any ordinary evening. When the car disappeared around the corner, my daughter asked if I was actually considering it. I looked at her, this fierce young woman I had raised alone, the person my parents had tried to erase before she was even born, and I told her no, but I was not done with them yet. My father put a blank check on my coffee table and told me that $250,000 and full reinstatement in the family trust was his final offer, as if 20 years of pretending I was dead could be settled the same way he settled his clients' portfolios. If you think you know what it feels like to have your own parents try to buy you like a prop for a party they built on lies, let me know if your family has ever had a moment like this one. Like and subscribe. Because the phone call I got 2 days later from my brother is what changed everything I thought I knew about the family I came from. That night, after my daughter went to bed, I pulled a fireproof lockbox from the back of my closet and spread the documents across my kitchen table. The notarized letter dated November 14th, 2004, signed and witnessed. 3 pages of legal language designed to make a 16-year-old girl and her unborn child disappear from the only family they had ever known. I photographed each page, uploaded them to my cloud storage, and made backup copies, because 20 years in the Army had taught me that the most important thing you can do before any operation is secure your evidence and know your terrain. Thursday, November 7th. My phone showed a South Carolina area code I did not recognize, and I almost let it go to voicemail. It was my brother. I had not heard his voice in 20 years. It was deeper now, the voice of a man in his 40s instead of the 22-year-old who had watched from the upstairs window while I stood in the rain. He told me he had no right to call and no reason to expect me to listen, and then he talked for over an hour. And what he told me rearranged everything I thought I understood about the family I had come from. The grandson story had been my mother's invention from start to finish. She had read the Army Times feature 2 years ago, but had not read it carefully. She saw the word child and the word officer and built an entire narrative about a boy, named him after my father, told her church friends he was enrolled at the Citadel, described his plans to carry on the family name in finance. She had invented a complete human being out of a magazine article she had skimmed, and my father had gone along with it because the lie was easier to maintain than the truth. They had been dining out on this imaginary grandson for months, showing his supposed future to 200 people who never thought to ask for a photograph. And there was more. My brother told me that the year I was expelled, my father had quietly redistributed my share of the family trust to my brother and sister, which meant that for 20 years, while I was living on a private's pay and feeding my daughter ramen noodles, my siblings had been collecting the financial benefit of my erasure. My brother's voice, when he told me he had known. He had known, and he had never said a word, because saying something would have cost him money and comfort, and he was not ready to pay that price until he watched our parents try to buy me like a stage prop for their anniversary photo. He told me about the photo on the mantelpiece, my school portrait from when I was 15, the last one taken before they threw me out, had been displayed in their living room for 20 years. They told every visitor it was their youngest daughter doing mission work overseas. The same face, frozen at 15, used as proof that the family was whole and loving, while the real girl behind that face was raising a child alone in a 1-bedroom apartment and learning how to field strip a rifle at Fort Jackson. Anyone who has watched a parent get older knows how quickly the people around them start making decisions as if the parent is no longer in the room, but my parents had done something different, something worse. They had not just erased me. They had kept a version of me, a 15-year-old ghost made of glass and cardstock, and displayed her for strangers so that no one would ever ask the question that terrified them most, which was what had really happened to their third child. My brother told me one more thing. The anniversary party would include a family unity moment live-streamed on the church Facebook page, Pastor Crawford's idea. 200 witnesses in the room, and however many watching online. I thanked him and hung up. His offer to stand with me still held. My sister was with him. They were ready. That evening, I sat at my kitchen table with my daughter beside me and the retired colonel on speakerphone. My mentor had heard through her network that my parents had resurfaced. "What do you need?" she asked. I told her I was going to the party, not to give them what they wanted, to give myself what I needed. I was going to tell the truth, in front of every person who mattered to them, on their stage, during their precious live stream, and I was going to do it not to destroy them, but to stop letting them pretend I had never existed. My daughter's voice was when she said she was coming with me. The retired colonel said she would be there too. I called my brother that night. I told him not to warn our parents, not to tell them I was coming. He agreed. Then I sat at my kitchen window and looked out at the life I had built from absolutely nothing. The small house I was buying with a VA loan, the truck in the driveway I had paid for with money I earned wearing a uniform my parents had never seen. The quiet street where my daughter had learned to ride a bike and where no one had ever once made me feel like I needed to be smaller than I was. And I knew that in 1 week, I was going to drive 8 hours south to Charleston and show 200 people what family actually means. Anyone who has ever watched someone they love be treated like they no longer matter, like their sacrifice and their years and their quiet, steady love was worth less than the opinion of strangers, knows that there comes a point where silence stops being patience and starts being permission. I had reached that point, and I was not going to be quiet anymore. Saturday, November 15th, 2024. 6:47 in the evening. The grand ballroom at the Belmont Charleston Place was everything my parents would have chosen. Chandeliers dripping crystal, white tablecloths starched to precision, flower arrangements that probably cost more than my first month's rent in Goose Creek. 200 guests in formal attire, clutching champagne flutes and making small talk about golf handicaps and investment returns, and my parents standing on a raised platform at the far end of the room, glowing with the confidence of people who believed their entire world was exactly as they had arranged it. My mother wore champagne-colored silk. My father wore a tailored navy suit. A camera crew was already broadcasting the live stream to the church Facebook page, and I could see the comments scrolling on a monitor near the stage. Beautiful couple. God bless the Tate family. What an inspiration. I stood in the entrance with my daughter beside me. She wore a navy blue dress, simple and elegant. I had chosen black, professional, understated, impossible to ignore. She asked if I was okay, and I told her I was terrified, and she said that was not what she had asked. I looked at her, this young woman who had grown up knowing her grandparents had tried to erase her from existence, who had built her own strength from that knowledge instead of letting it break her, and I said yes, I was okay. We walked in. Heads began to turn. Someone near the door whispered that I was the woman from the article, the army officer. The whisper spread the way they always do in a room full of people who know each other's business. My father had just begun his speech. He was talking about 50 years of marriage and the principle that family is everything, his voice amplified by the microphone and captured by the live stream camera, and 200 faces watched adoringly while the comment section scrolled with praise. My mother saw me first. Her champagne smile froze, and I watched her hand tighten on my father's arm. He followed her gaze, stopped mid-sentence, and the room began to notice. Heads turning, whispers building, someone near the back saying loud enough to Carrie that it was his daughter, the one from the magazine, the one they thought was overseas. I walked toward the stage. The crowd parted. Not dramatically, this was not a movie, but people stepped aside because they could feel something was about to change. My daughter walked beside me, her chin high, her steps steady. My brother appeared at the edge of the crowd with my sister beside him. They did not try to stop me, they just watched. My father's voice came through the speakers, strained. He tried to say what a surprise it was, and I climbed the 3 steps to the platform and took the microphone from his hand before he could finish. I told them my name. I told them I was the youngest daughter, the one they had been told went to Europe 20 years ago. And then I told them the truth, that on November 14th, 2004, 20 years ago tomorrow, my parents discovered I was pregnant at 16, and that same night they threw me out of their house, had their lawyer draft papers disowning me, and told me I was dead to them. The silence in that ballroom was the loudest thing I had ever heard. I pulled the notarized letter from my bag and held it close enough to the camera for the words to be legible. And I read the clause about any child born to me being permanently excluded from all family records and genealogy and estate planning. And then I gestured to my daughter standing at the edge of the stage and told the room that this was their granddaughter, the one they had never met, and that the grandson they had been bragging about for months to everyone in this room did not exist. They had invented him from an article they did not bother to read carefully. My mother had named him after my father, told friends he was attending the Citadel, described his career plans. An entire human being, fabricated from nothing, presented to 200 people as proof that the family was whole. My brother stepped onto the stage. My sister followed. They stood beside me, not touching, but present. My brother said she was telling the truth, that he and my sister had been there that night, had watched from the window while their parents put their 16-year-old sister out in the rain, and that they had never said anything, and that silence was their failure. The retired church secretary, the woman who had watched everything from my kitchen window 20 years ago, stood from the back row and said she had seen me standing in that rain for 10 minutes before I walked away, and that my parents had never once asked where I went. The live stream comments exploded faster than anyone could read. The pastor stepped forward and asked my father directly if what I had said was true. My father looked at the crowd, the mayor, the Rotary Board members, the church elders, and I watched him search for words that could spin this into something acceptable, and I watched him fail. He said it was a difficult time. I kept my voice calm and said that he threw me out because I was pregnant, because his reputation mattered more than his child. The pastor's face was grave. My daughter climbed onto the stage and took my hand and spoke into the microphone. She said she was the granddaughter they never wanted, that she had known her whole life that her grandparents chose their reputation over her mother and by extension over her, and that they could have known her. They could have been at her birthday parties and her school plays and her high school graduation, and they chose not to, and they did not get to pretend that was ever her fault. Her voice cracked on the last word, and I held her hand tighter. I handed the microphone back to my father and told him, quietly enough that only those on stage could hear, that I had not come there to tear him down. I had come to stop being invisible. Then I turned to the room and raised my voice. I told them I was not asking for their pity. 20 years ago, I was thrown out with nothing, and today I was a captain in the United States Army with a daughter who was a sophomore at UNC Chapel Hill. and we had built our lives without the help of the people standing behind me on this stage. I told them I was not there for money or revenge. I was there because my parents had tried to buy my silence the week before, and because they deserved to face the consequences of what they did, not in private, but in front of the community they had always valued more than their own children. I told them I would not sue, would not contest the will, would not demand $1. The disinheritance papers I had kept for 20 years would stay with me as a reminder of who they really were, not as something to use against them. But I told my parents directly, in front of every person who mattered to them and every person watching online, that if they ever spread lies about me or my daughter again, if they ever tried to contact her without her consent, I would make every document public. I had the letter. I had time-stamped photographs. I had witnesses. And now, I had 200 more. My mentor appeared at my elbow. She asked if I was ready. I was. As we walked through the doors, I heard the pastor's voice behind us. "Richard, Diane, I think we need to talk privately tonight." My daughter squeezed my hand as we stepped into the November evening. The air was cold and clean, and for the first time in 20 years, I felt like I could breathe. The fallout began within hours. By midnight, the livestream clip had been shared over 800 times. By morning, that number had tripled. 47 guests left the party within 30 minutes of my departure. My brother called with a full report. The mayor walked out without saying goodbye, the church board chair followed, and 2 families actually apologized to him on their way out. Apologized for never asking where I was, for accepting the story without question. By Monday, my father had resigned his position as elder at Covenant Hills Church. By Wednesday, the Rotary Club board announced a membership review. And through it all, I was at Fort Liberty answering emails and running supply logistics for 120 soldiers who needed me to be exactly who I was. 1 week later, my mother called. Her voice was smaller than I had ever heard it. She told me she was not calling to apologize because she did not know how to apologize for what they had done. She told me she had watched the live stream 11 times, kept looking at my face, trying to see her daughter, the one she had put out in the rain. She told me my father was not doing well. The church, the Rotary, his colleagues, everyone looked at him differently now. I told her I had not done it to punish them. She said she knew, that I had done it because I had to stop pretending, because they had given me no other choice. Then she said the thing that made me close my eyes. She said she had called because she wanted to hear my voice, because she had not heard it in 20 years, and she was afraid she might never hear it again. And because my daughter had stood on that stage and told 200 people she had spent her whole life knowing her grandparents did not want her. And my mother said she could not breathe when she heard those words. I told her I was not ready to forgive her, and I might never be. But I was not going to hang up on her either. She said that was more than she deserved. I said yes, it was. We stayed on the line for another minute without speaking, and then she said goodbye and did not ask for anything more. Thanksgiving 2024. My dining table, the one I had found at an estate sale 3 years ago and refinished myself on my back porch over a long weekend, seated 12 people. It had never been that full. My daughter sat at my right hand, my mentor at my left. The retired church secretary had flown up from Charleston and was teaching my nephew how to fold napkins into swans. My brother carved the turkey while his wife set out the side dishes. My sister's daughters argued over who got to light the candles. My parents were not there. We had not reached that point, and maybe we never would. But looking around that table, I realized I had spent 20 years mourning a family that had never really wanted me. And now I was surrounded by people who had chosen to be here, who wanted to know me, not a version of me, not a prop for their image, but the real person sitting at the head of her own table, in a house she was paying for with money she had earned wearing a uniform that meant something. My daughter stood to make a toast. She pulled out a folded piece of paper and read what she had written. She told the table that when she was little, she used to ask why she did not have grandparents like the other kids, and I had always told her the truth, that they had made a choice, and that choice was not about her. She said it took her years to understand, but she understood now, and everything she had, everything she was, existed because I never let their choice define us. She raised her glass and said, "To the family we build, not the one we're born into." And everyone drank. My parents still have not apologized, not really. My father has barely spoken since the party. My mother calls sometimes and I answer when I can. My brother and sister are trying. We are all trying. But I am not waiting for anyone to change. I am living the life I built, the one I earned, the one that belongs entirely to me. Every Thanksgiving, my daughter sits at my right hand and my brother carves the turkey and the table is full of people who chose to be there. And when the phone rings, I answer it without holding my breath, because the only people who call my house now are the ones who mean it when they say they love me. That is not a happy ending. It is a real one. And real endings do not need applause. They just need truth. If this story meant something to you, share it with someone who needs to hear it today, and like and subscribe, because there is always someone sitting quietly in a house right now, holding something painful she has carried for longer than anyone knows. And maybe this is the story that tells her she does not have to carry it alone anymore.